Sharon Graham is a General Secretary of the union Unite. They represent part of the striking ambulance workforce. In an interview over the weekend, Graham told Sky that the government's approach to negotiations with NHS staff has been so woeful that she's starting to think something very sinister might be going on.
This employer, being the government, is not interested in doing a deal as far as the NHS is concerned. And I have to say, we are concluding now that there must be a much more sinister reason for this, because this level of self-harm is unprecedented. The public are crying out. I came here in a cab this morning and the cab driver was saying, why don't they just give a pay rise to the NHS? Everybody wants that to happen. It's almost like there is another reason for them doing what they're doing, because it's total incompetence otherwise.
What do you think that reason is then?
Well, I think that they are looking to privatise the NHS. Genuinely, I believe that they're looking as this is the moment they can privatise the NHS. I said when I was on your programme the last time that I was very concerned about the Chancellor, who was the health secretary, who wanted the NHS in the American trade deal. And there was a big fight about making sure it wasn't in the American trade deal. There is something unusual going on here, that they will not come to the table. There are choices that can be made that means we can pay for this. There is not a problem about paying with the fifth richest country in the world. There is something going on here. Otherwise, they are at a level of incompetence not known, because it's unreal.
It's a big claim to say the government is looking to privatise the NHS, and that goes against everything that they've said about the NHS remaining free at the point of use. I mean, Labour are prepared to countenance more private sector involvement in the NHS right now than the government. You know, do you have any evidence to back this up? Because I guess what they would say is, look, at the minute, we're spending more on debt interest than education. This is why there has to be pay restraint.
Well, actions speak louder than words to me. So words are cheap. There is a crisis in the NHS. They can come to the table and negotiate on this crisis. All the general secretaries, including me, have said we will be there anytime, any place, anywhere. We'll cancel any meeting to be there in that room. He is the CEO of this group of workers, and he refuses to come to the table. Now, it's either that he doesn't know what to do when he gets to that table. I mean, maybe he doesn't know how to negotiate. I don't know. Maybe it's that there is another issue going on. But we have to look at what's happening. Why would they not be coming to the table and deal with this issue? Everyone is crying out for them to get this issue solved. And unless they solve the issue of workers and the crisis of workers in NHS and those people leaving the NHS, we will never be able to get the NHS back on its knees. And they know that.
That was Sharon Graham suggesting the reason the Tories aren't putting a stop to the crisis in the NHS is that they want to privatise it. She's saying if they cared about the NHS, they'd make a deal with the nurses and the ambulance drivers, but their refusal to come to the negotiating table means that there's potentially something more sinister going on. Her only explanation is that they actively want to or are willing to collapse the NHS so that they can privatise it. Is she right, though? Well, a former Tory Health Secretary and Chancellor hasn't given us many reasons to feel reassured. Sajid Javid has published this essay in The Times. We need to agree a new NHS future or the 1948 dream dies. Now, remember, the Tories opposed the NHS in 1948, so the idea this is their dream is a little bit far-fetched. The subheading, only a cross-party consensus and an honest talk with British people can deliver reforms needed for a national jewel to survive. Again, kind of pretending, I think, that he cares about that national jewel. Let's get on to the argument. He says, for the NHS, when faced with excess demand, the only rationing mechanism is to make people wait. This is not the norm in any comparable country. Across Europe, we see different versions of a contributory principle to complement public financing. This helps providers manage demand and direct it to more efficient methods of supply. Take Ireland, where some people are entitled to free healthcare through the public system based on household income. Others must pay nominal fees. One such is a €75 charge if you attend an injury unit without a referral from a GP. If you have the referral, the service is free. The advantage of this system is people take active steps to assess whether their demand for frontline services is required. Too often we hear doctors and nurses frustrated at people making unnecessary trips to frontline services, which takes time from other patients. Would the same level of demand exist here if this Irish model were adopted? This extends to GP appointments. In Norway and Sweden, a visit to the GP comes with a contribution of about £20. For some people, like my parents, that is a noticeable part of the weekly budget, but as demonstrated by so many other countries, it is possible to means test this provision. So he wants to introduce charges and means testing into the NHS. Javid also goes on to approvingly cite the German social health insurance model. Universal healthcare in Germany is achieved by individuals opting into either various public or various private health insurance schemes. Now, someone not impressed with Javid's suggestions is Gordon Brown. He wrote this response piece in The Guardian. Mark my words, this will be the end of the NHS if the Tories have their way. Subheading, they are now openly contemplating a more privately funded healthcare system. It wouldn't just be unfair, it makes no economic sense. And he argues this. Sajid Javid, a former Chancellor and Health Secretary, has written approvingly of the £20 fee that some European countries charge for visits to the GP. He labels Ireland's €75 or £66 bill for attending an A&E without a GP's referral as merely nominal, as if it's so modest that a higher charge would be more appropriate. And he calls for a national debate on the contribution private financing can make to healthcare. But the direction in which the Conservatives are travelling is already clear. The sick would pay for being sick, and charging would force, as has happened with GP and hospital fees in France, the better off sections of the population to take out private insurance, inevitably creating in its wake a two-tier healthcare system. He goes on to say of the Conservatives, their desire to break with the British model is not only morally concerning, it would also be very costly and economically wasteful. Never do NHS doctors or nurses have to ask sick patients, quote, who is paying for this? When we leave the hospital or GP surgery, we are not pursued by bills or subject to complex negotiations with insurance companies or legal threats. But as the overseas experience of billing and means testing shows, charges not only mean higher administration and collection costs and thus raise far less than is predicted, they also discourage the sick from seeking treatment until too late, when more severe problems require not only more intensive but more expensive interventions. Gordon Brown, in that piece, which is worth reading, I think, goes on to make the case for modernisation in the way the NHS is run, but says the best way to fund it is still through progressive taxation and for a publicly managed system, publicly managed healthcare provision.
Are the Tories trying to privatise the NHS? The simple answer is yes. Now, the reason why I say that is because privatisation can refer to many different aspects of how the NHS is run. So one aspect of that is an increased role for private healthcare providers. That's already happening. So you're seeing many scans taking place, lots of tests taking place, which are being run by privatized companies. That's already happening. Bits of the NHS which are profitable for private companies have long been sold off. Now, when it comes to the question of whether the NHS will continue to be free at the point of use for every British citizen, that is the direction of travel ideologically for the Conservative Party. If you look at what's coming out from the Tufton Street think tank ecology of the Institute for Economic Affairs or Taxpayers Alliance, they've long said the thing that needs to happen is that there is some degree of patient contribution. So higher prescription charges, paying for hospital visits, paying for GP visits. That's what's going on in terms of the think tank world, which is influencing Conservative MPs, policymakers, and ministers. That's something which they've wanted to do for a really long time. So it's not surprising that Sajid Javid is trying to turn the present crisis of the NHS, where every single person in this country broadly agrees that it needs more funding, that funding's got to come from somewhere, and trying to turn that crisis to the advantage of his ideological bedmates. Now, there isn't an appetite for it. I think getting people to pay for a GP visit or an A&E visit is very much a bridge too far. That is, such a big, not just political and economic shift from the founding principles of the NHS, but it's also a pretty big cultural and psychological shift from what we think of the NHS as being. So I don't think that this is something that's got a legs in it. And it's one of those things that can also happen. The more you talk about a policy, the more unpopular it can become. Now, I read that Gordon Brown article, Michael, and there was lots in there that I agreed with, but there was a big honking omission from the article, which is that Gordon Brown, when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer and later on Prime Minister, during the New Labour years, oversaw a great deal of private involvement with the NHS. Now, it is totally true that New Labour significantly increased NHS funding and waiting times drastically reduced. But you also had a massive role for the private sector, most notably with private finance initiatives. Now, if you cast your mind back, I think this might have been 4 or 5 years ago. Do you remember the collapse of Carillion, which was one of those big super duper outsourcing companies? The collapse of Carillion, which had taken on a lot of these private finance contracts within the NHS sector, endangered the upkeep and the running of NHS hospitals. So, you know, yes, good thing, Gordon Brown, that you're talking about privatization. Yes, good thing, Gordon Brown, that you're talking about keeping the NHS free at the point of use. But unless there is some recognition within Labour circles that their own governments have contributed to this crisis of the NHS, which is exacerbated by the extraction of profit by the private sector, you're not going to be able to, I think, adequately fix the problem down the road. And in fact, when you look at the way in which the likes of Wes Streeting are going, the likelihood is you're going to, repeat the same mistakes again, expecting a different outcome.
I'm not an expert on this, but when it comes to the NHS, I think I am quite sympathetic to New Labour. And I mean, the reason I say that is because if you look at the outcomes were really good. And, what the Tories will say and what, lots of people say, it's not just you either have the NHS or you have sort of the hellscape, which is American healthcare. And that's true. There are a lot of other options. There are countries which provide universal healthcare to a high standard where you don't have everything completely publicly owned. Most of the continent, for example. I mean, I think this is entirely cynical what the Tories are trying to do. There's the old Noam Chomsky line that what you'll try and do is run down services and then try and privatize them. I mean, you couldn't have a more clear example of that. But when it comes to New Labour and Gordon Brown, I don't think what they actually wanted to do, like Sajid Javid, was ideologically deconstruct the NHS. And I think if you bring in a few, I feel just a bit agnostic about it. If you bring in a few private companies here and there and you massively get waiting lists down, fair play to you. Am I being too easy on New Labour here?
So the point I'm making is that different kinds of privatization have different effects, right? So if you introduce GP charges or A&E charges, that has an immediate and negative effect on patients because one, it starts costing you money to be sick. It's essentially a tax on the sick, the long-term disabled, and the elderly. It's deeply regressive, and it also discourages people from seeking healthcare when they need it. Now, that is an immediate, short-term negative impact, and it also has long-term impacts as well in terms of the overall health of the country. Now, something like PFI delivered the immediate result of going, okay, well, how can we get investment in the NHS up without having to increase the tax burden, which was kind of the New Labour strategy. And yes, in the short and the medium term, it delivered on those things. But when you look at the overall picture of one, the sort of leaching of public money into the private sector, which means that overall things cost a lot more. It's like you're buying it on, buy now, pay later. Overall, you're paying more to the private sector. And two, when you look at the vulnerability of these services, when you farm bits out to the private sector. So if you do have one of these outsourcing firms collapse, or one of the things we know about outsourcing firms is that they subcontract out and they subcontract out and they subcontract out. And the need to deliver profit at any means necessary means that ultimately you do get cut corners and cutbacks and worse quality services and maintenance being delivered with very, foggy chains of accountability. Those are things which I think medium term and long term are really bad for the NHS. So I totally hear you on New Labour did what they said they'd do. They got those waiting lists down. They did that very well. But those seeds of crisis, really, that was looming when Carillion collapsed, those were planted by a New Labour government. And I think that if the thing that we agree on is we want more funding for the NHS, well, sure we do. We also want an NHS which has got long-term sustainability and isn't going to, lurch into another private finance disaster.